They called it a hobby with receipts, a phase I'd outgrow when the rent got real. And when I set my samples on the table, they passed them like coasters. Careful not to taste hope. I learned to smile without showing teeth, to swallow the sting with the same breath I used to sell to strangers. The night it boiled over, I didn't shout. I just packed my tins, wiped the crumbs they left like footprints across my pride, and promised myself I'd stop asking people for a kind of love they only gave to things they understood. What they didn't see was the ledger on my phone. The pre-dawn orders, the knocks at doors before the city yawned awake. What they didn't know was that every smirk was an interest payment, compounding into something I could spend. And when the chance came to cash it in, I did. They said real jobs had supervisors, pensions, lanyards that beeped you through doors. Proof that someone important needed you at 9 sharp. I learned to love the opposite. The silence before sunup when the dough breathed. The heat that pressed stories into crust. The strangers who remembered my name because the first bite felt like home. If value is what people returned for, then I was building value one box at a time, even if my family only counted pay stubs and titles. So I split my days. Smiles for buyers, spreadsheets for margins, and a voice in my head that asked, every night, if dignity could be baked and sold wholesale. I didn't know I was already answering. At dinner, they measured my life in loss. Lost weekends, lost security, lost chance to marry stability while it still looked at me. I measured it in repeats. Same faces each Saturday. Same text on Thursdays. Can you add 2 more? I was careful with my numbers and reckless with my faith. And maybe that's what annoyed them most, that I could be scared and still show up. When Vic joked that ovens don't come with promotions, I laughed, because he wasn't wrong. Promotions are just new problems with better lighting. I wanted those problems and the light. The first real hit came from a corporate assistant who found me through a tagged post. 200 breakfast boxes for a quarterly meeting. Morty, I said yes before I calculated anything, then spent the night calculating everything, bargaining with timers like they were gods. When the sun rose, the apartment looked like a bakery exploded, and then learned manners. I loaded the car with the last of the savings and a playlist that wouldn't let me think about failing. Somewhere between the second and third delivery, I realized the fear had volume, and I could turn it down. I dropped the boxes at a glass castle where the lobby smelled like money, trying not to. I wore my cleanest sneakers and a smile I'd practiced in the mirror, pleasant but not pleading. Security scanned my ID like it might bite. The assistant counted with the reverence of a person about to impress their boss. When the doors closed behind me, I exhaled and didn't notice the man watching from the mezzanine, making a note of the label on each box. He would change everything. My family would say he changed me. Truth is, I was already on my way. The corporate order didn't change my life. It changed my calendar. Suddenly Mondays had meaning because that's when reorders were confirmed, and Thursdays were for ingredient runs. And Sundays, the day they said should be for rest or family, became quiet laboratories where I failed in private and named new flavors after the feeling of getting back up. Word of mouth did its slow miracle. A receptionist messaged for her sister's bridal shower. A cafe wanted a weekly dozen to test. A cyclist club asked for energy bars that tasted like treats but behaved like fuel. I built a system out of tape and timers, stuck brand stickers straight, and taught myself to be 2 people. The one who baked like an artist and the one who priced like a surgeon. When I allowed myself to glance at the totals, the numbers weren't loud yet, but they were clear, and they were moving in the right direction. The part that scared me was how much more I now knew I could lose. At the Saturday market, I learned to make strangers feel like regulars in 30 seconds. I remembered allergies, wrote names in looping script, and tucked an extra bite into the box when someone looked like their week had been unkind. Between rushes, I counted costs and watched the neighboring stalls. How the soap maker bundled value. How the florist lifted stems to the sun like a benediction. How the coffee guy played 3 songs that always made the line longer. I wasn't competing with them. I was learning a language. And when a toddler smeared jam on his cheeks and clapped for more, his mother asked if I catered office breakfasts, and I heard myself say yes with the certainty of someone who'd already survived their own worst-case scenario. The work didn't feel smaller as it grew. It felt sharper, like each choice clicked into place, and the picture came into focus. Almost. Scaling meant ovens that didn't sigh and countertops that didn't wobble when I leaned too hard. I ran the math until the margins stopped feeling like a dare and started feeling like a plan. A small equipment loan for a commercial mixer, a second-hand proofer, maybe a shared kitchen slot to get me out of the landlord's temper. I dressed in the kind of neutral that apologizes for nothing and carried a folder thick with invoices, social proof, and a forecast that I had rehearsed out loud until the numbers sounded like a story. The loan officer nodded with polite interest that felt like a glass wall between us. When she asked about guarantors, I breathed slow and offered references instead. Clients who returned, vendors who trusted me, a vendor line of credit I hadn't touched. She smiled at the word discipline, like it was a flower, pressed between the pages of a book she had once loved. I believed for a minute that belief would be enough. The email arrived with corporate diction that tried to make no sound at all. Regret to inform you, after careful review, insufficient demonstration of stability, and a sentence about concerns raised by a personal reference that felt like a trapdoor under a polite rug. My chest did the small traitor's dance it does before tears, but I kept my hands busy, washing a bowl that was already clean, straightening labels that were already straight. I told myself it was a misunderstanding and dialed the bank. The hold music was cheerful like a sales floor, and when the officer answered, every syllable stepped lightly around liability. She couldn't disclose details, but she could say there was hesitation from a long-standing family contact about my resilience under stress. The sink drained with a hollow sound. I thanked her in a voice so even it worried. If a person can be both furious and unsurprised, that was me, because this echoed a tone I knew too well. I visited the house under the pretense of dropping off a box of extras. I didn't have time to deliver. Their living room smelled like fabric softener and a decade of the same opinions. The television muttered the news. Small talk edged us around anything real. When the question finally arrived, how did the bank meeting go? It wore concern like a borrowed coat. I said it was delayed, and 3 glances crossed the room too quickly. A blink, a swallow, a correction of posture. I didn't ask. I watched. Later, alone on the porch, I checked the loan portal again and saw the note I'd missed the first time. Adverse input from community reference, a name redacted, a timestamp that matched the hour after our dinner. I put the box on the step and left without knocking, the air cold enough to make honesty feel easier. If they had tried to save me from embarrassment, they had delivered me to it, and I wasn't done being seen. The bank wouldn't name the source, but silence has a signature, and this one matched the way my family loved me. Careful, conditional, wrapped in the language of protection until you unwrap it and find doubt. I pulled up the portal notes again, stared at phrases that sounded like they'd been copy-pasted from a kitchen lecture. Unstable schedule, emotional volatility under pressure, limited managerial experience, and felt the old training kick in. Breathe. Sort? Proceed? I called the receptionist from the corporate order, asked if she'd ever been contacted for a reference. She hadn't. Vendors hadn't either. The only people who knew the worst of my messy beginnings were the people who had watched me try. I wrote down the phrase, community reference, said it out loud until it lost power, and then did the unthinkable. Emailed the officer to formally request a review of adverse input. If this was going to break us, I wanted it on record who dropped the first stone. The bank replied by noon with a document so redacted it looked like a secret wearing blackout shades. But the breadcrumbs were there. Dates that aligned with family dinners. A phone exchange with a tenured supervisor at a local manufacturer. And adjectives that felt like fingerprints. Stubborn. Unwilling to compromise. Disregards advice. I heard those words in a familiar cadence. 1 part fear, 1 part pride. All parts love stranded on the wrong side of a boundary. I drove to the plant because calling would give them time to arrange the story. The parking lot was a gray sea of sedans and resignation. The security gate swallowed my name like it had no calories. On the line I found him, bent over a jammed machine, sleeves rolled, a posture I recognized from every lesson had taught me about work. He straightened, smiled that automatic father smile, and then saw the reason I was there flicker across my face. The machine clanked again. Neither of us reached for it. We stood in the narrow hallway where the sound drops a notch and the air smells like oil and old coffee. I asked plainly if anyone from a bank had called him about me. He massaged the bridge of his nose the way he does when math doesn't give him mercy, then said he might have offered context, because context prevents mistakes, because young people don't see the long fall. He said I was brilliant but impulsive, disciplined but fragile when disappointed. He said it like he was naming weather patterns that had helped him steer ships. I felt something in me snap quiet, like a twig nobody hears, because the forest is already loud. I told him I had become resilient in a house that didn't allow a person to fail, without being labeled the failure. He flinched, just once, and then defended the call as love shaped like caution. I told him love shaped like caution had tripped the alarm that locked a door I had the key for, and then I asked if he'd do it again. At home, she was waiting with 2 mugs and a script that began with, "We only want what's best," and ended with, "You're not ready to manage people." I placed the printouts on the table like coasters again, but this time I let the slime, ink, stain the wood. She scanned the blocks of black, then the surviving phrases, and her voice sharpened on the word. Stubborn like it knew where it had come from. She admitted she had called the bank officer too because someone had to say the hard truths before a lender learned them at my expense. She listed sacrifices they had made, how the world does not forgive softness, how this was discipline, not sabotage. I told her discipline is waking at 4 to bake and at 9 to balance accounts, not making sure your daughter's ceiling is low enough she doesn't bump her head. When my brother tried to mediate, she said I was twisting it into betrayal. I said betrayal does its best work while dressed as advice. The argument didn't explode. It eroded. Every sentence pulled a little sand from the shoreline we'd called family until the shape no longer matched the map. When I said I would not be coming by for a while, the silence that followed felt like a blessing and a bruise. I packed up the photos I kept on their hallway shelf, the ones where I am small and winning something that fit in my hands, and left with my palms empty, which is not the same as leaving with nothing. In the car, I let the tears come and then told them they couldn't drive. I went home, opened a spreadsheet, and stripped my plan of anything that relied on permission. If the door would not open, I would buy a hinge and build a new door. I updated my site with catering packages, messaged 3 co-working spaces, mapped a route of cafes whose lines wrapped corners. Somewhere between line items and emails, the ache found its use. It became fuel. The email subject screamed, "Urgent, 500 breakfast boxes, Monday," and urgency has a smell. Hot printers, nervous coffee, the metallic tang of a clock that won't slow down. I said yes before fear could brief me on all the reasons it was right, then built a war room out of my apartment, timers like artillery, checklists like prayers, neighbors bribed with cinnamon to fold and tape. At 3 a.m. the kitchen sang, mixers shouldering dough, trays exhaling sugar, labels marching in clean formation. Dawn threw a pale flag through the window, and I loaded a borrowed van until its suspension had opinions. In the lobby delivery video, someone filmed the neat geometry of my boxes sliding into rows, my logo tiny and disciplined, and posted it. The clip found an algorithm with a sweet tooth, then found the city. By noon, my DMs bloomed like a field that had waited for rain. It felt like the world clearing its throat to say my name correctly. Virality doesn't feel like fireworks up close. It feels like triage. The website crashed with the theater of a fainting diva. The phone jittered itself across the counter. And I learned to answer 3 questions at once. Quantities, allergies, lead times. I rented a shared kitchen slot that smelled like ambition and disinfectant, signed for a second-hand proofer with a wobble I could live with, and interviewed my first part-time hire in flour-dusted sneakers because there wasn't time to change. I rewrote my pricing sheet with a steadier hand and paired every yes with a boundary that protected the yes. Between shifts, I scrolled the video comments and found strangers defending me like regulars. Best boxes ever, worth the wait. She remembered my kids, nut allergy. The noise rose, but so did my competence. For the first time, the business felt less like a dare, and more like a machine that converted attention into trust, without stripping the soul out of the recipe. The message arrived from the mezzanine man with the calm voice. He'd seen the clip, sampled the boxes, wanted to talk scale, not sparkle. In his office, numbers were furniture. Average order value, repeat rate, cogs sliced thin enough to see daylight. He asked me to walk him through the loudest hour of my operation and the quietest fear in my head. I said the loudest hour was oven choreography and courier timing. The quietest fear was quality dying slowly at the altar of volume. He didn't blink. Quality is a system, he said, not a mood. He proposed a pilot. Consolidated ingredient purchasing, a pop-up in a high-traffic lobby, and a test run with a reputable co-packer to handle the parts that don't require my hands. In exchange, mentorship and a small, convertible note that would breathe without suffocating. It sounded like scaffolding instead of a leash. I left with a term sheet and a feeling I hadn't let myself keep since childhood. Momentum with a grown-up seatbelt. The pop-up felt like stepping onto a moving sidewalk. The building's tide swept people past my table, and the scent did the convincing I couldn't spare mouth for. We sold out before the second elevator dinged, which is an exaggeration unless you were there. Behind the table, my new hire ran point like she'd been born with a headset. I managed misfires. 1 late courier, 2 mislabeled boxes, with a calm that startled me. Mateo hovered the way good mentors do, close enough to catch you if the stage tilts, far enough to let you own the performance. After, he walked me through a debrief that treated my day like data. Your choke point is packaging speed. Your moat is repeat delight, he said, then added. And you're almost outgrowing your hands. He mentioned a regional co-packer he trusted, a facility with spare line time, and a chance to test a 3-item SKU batch without committing my soul. The map was drawing itself, and I had the pen. We signed at a small table that looked like it had witnessed 100 beginnings and a few graceful endings. The note was modest, the milestones blunt. Hit on-time delivery rate, maintain customer rating, protect unit economics like a boundary you don't apologize for. I walked out with access to a buyer network, a negotiated flour price that made margins inhale, and calendar holds for meetings with logistics and a co-packer whose floor I'd tour next week. On the train home, the city blurred into a patient ribbon. I thought about the version of me who had packed tins in a storm of doubt and realized she was still here, just better equipped. When the train surfaced, my phone caught a message from home, another invitation to dinner, the kind that assumes nothing had changed. I typed a soft reply that set a new date on a new timeline. The work ahead was a mountain, but the path wasn't imaginary anymore. It had guardrails. It had witnesses. It had me. The email from Matteo was short enough to feel dangerous. We closed. Plants on the brink. I want you to steady it. I read it twice and felt the floor shift like an elevator that overshot, then corrected. The manufacturer wasn't a stranger. It was the backdrop of my childhood. The place where holidays were scheduled around overtime and pride was counted in units shipped. He laid out the logic. Reliable but under-led facility, legacy contracts wasting away. A culture that mistook survival for strategy. He said he'd take the board seat and asked me to take the wheel. Interim general manager. 90 days to stop the bleeding and diagnose the cure. I thought of my parents' doubts filed at the bank like permanent record, then pictured the people on that floor who had done nothing but show up for years. I didn't want revenge. I wanted structure. Yes, I wrote, keeping my hands from shaking over the keys. Send me the numbers. I'll bring a plan. The boardroom smelled like contract paper and guarded optimism. Matteo walked me through the cap table as if pointing out constellations. Majority stake secured, debt restructured to breathe, but not slack. Runway dependent on operational discipline. I presented a 90-day triage. Line balance, audit, scrap rate autopsy, supplier renegotiation, and a shift calendar that respected bodies without coddling waste. R flagged morale like a cracked windshield. I said transparency was cheaper than rumors and faster than memos. When the question came, why you? I didn't tell them a story about destiny. I told them about throughput and trust, about standing on floors where schedules were prayers, and about turning attention into repeatable outcomes. Matteo didn't sell me. He validated the math. The votes landed in a tidy chorus. I signed the interim letter with a grip that felt steadier than my pulse. The door we'd forced open at the bank had another side, and I was walking through it with my own keycard. The announcement on the plant floor felt like stepping into a family photo and finding yourself in the center. I stood on a crate, microphone that squeaked once like it had opinions about me, and introduced myself without titles or TED Talk cadence. Just what was broken, what would change, and what would. Safety wasn't negotiable, respect wasn't seasonal, and the first week would be for listening with a stopwatch. I saw my father 2 rows back, arms crossed in a way that had braced my childhood, and my mother near the office door, trying to read the room faster than it read her. I kept my eyes on the lines I'd drawn. No overtime ambushes, posted targets everyone could touch, a bonus pool tied to waste reduction. I asked for grace for mistakes I'd owned publicly and promised that good ideas would outrank tenure, including mine. When the murmurs rose, they sounded less like revolt than recalibration. It wasn't applause. It was space. The first hard hour arrived disguised as routine, a packaging line jam, labels skewing, tempers fraying. Old habit said, push through. The new plan said, pause and fix. I called a stop, counted it out loud like a metronome against panic, and walked the jam with the crew until the flaw revealed itself. Misaligned guides installed. During a rushed repair, my father started to step in with a shortcut. I shook my head and asked him to document the deviation instead. He took the clipboard like it might burn, then did what he's always done. The precise thing in front of him, better than anyone. My mother approached with a complaint about the new rota. I asked her to join Clara's focus group and bring 3 alternatives that met the same constraints. She opened her mouth to argue and closed it around a new taste. Accountability that didn't humiliate. When the line restarted, the rhythm felt different, still loud, but cleaner, like the room had remembered its job. By week's end, the scrap bin was lighter. The whiteboard had more check marks than promises, and the lunchroom volume had shifted from complaint to critique, which is how you know people think their words will matter tomorrow. I posted the first metrics in the hallway, targets in black, outcomes in blue, and watched the cluster around them swell with cautious pride. My parents hovered at the edge the way families do at school plays, unsure when to clap. I didn't give them a moment to bow into. I gave them standards to meet. In my office, temporary, window onto the floor, I sat with the quiet that follows a decision to grow up twice in the same year, and wrote the next week's plan. There was satisfaction, yes, but not the sugary kind I used to chase. This was protein. This was going to build something. And it tasted, finally, like respect baked from scratch and served without apology. The emergency landed at 6:12 a.m. A supplier recall that turned our flour into a liability, and our morning shift into a question mark. A penalty clause from our biggest client sat like a loaded verdict if we missed delivery by noon. Old management would have gambled and hoped. I shut the lines, took the hit on idle time, and convened a war table with ops, QA, and procure. People muttered about wasted hours. I showed them the math where one bad batch could erase a month of progress and a dozen jobs. While Clara worked the client with hourly updates, I called the backup mill I'd priced out 2 weeks ago and paid rush freight like it was a tourniquet. My father hovered with a shortcut on his tongue. I asked him to lead inspection on all inbound pallets, no exceptions. He nodded once, the way a craftsperson salutes a standard. When the new flour rolled in at 9:38, the room remembered how to breathe. Stopping the line cost us goodwill we couldn't spend twice, so I called a floor huddle and drew our runway on a sheet big enough to scare me. Orders, cash, headcount, the cliff if we missed. No theatrics, just arithmetic and respect. I proposed a 2-week overtime freeze, cross-training to unclog bottlenecks, and a waste reduction bounty that would pay out of savings, not promises. Grumbling formed like weather around me. I let it pour, then asked for alternatives that met the same math. My mother spoke first, careful, skeptical, suggesting a split shift that preserved school pickups and cut paid idle time. We ran it through the constraints and it clicked like a gear catching. I watched the room notice that power wasn't a thunderbolt. It was a calculator and a whiteboard marker used in public. We voted with hands, not whispers. When they lifted, I knew we'd bought the one thing money can't: consent to be led. The certification auditor arrived with the smile of someone who likes finding dust on top of door frames. We needed the stamp to keep the contract Matteo had pried open, and our last file audit predated half my changes. I walked her through the new SOPs. Clear, lived in, no perfume. Then shadowed the swabs and spot checks without narrating over the evidence. When she paused at sanitation, logs that once had creative gaps, I didn't blame the past. I showed the failsafe. Digital time locks, peer sign-offs, and a corrective action thread that read like a shop floor diary. Midway through, she asked who wrote the lockout-to-gout refresher. I said, Rakeshaw, and watched my father pretend to study the floor while pride fought with surprise under his jaw. The report closed with findings, not failures, and a provisional pass pending one minor fix. Relief didn't gallop. It exhaled, measured, and put its boots back on. At dusk, a thunder had rolled in with the dramatic timing of a rival actor. Lightning flicked the lights. The line shuddered to a halt. The generator coughed like an old smoker. The clock said our courier window was shrinking to a keyhole. I split the team. Half to manual pack the ready boxes by headlamp, half to push a hot run at the co-packer I'd booked as contingency the minute the weather app started shouting. My mother bristled at the off-site plan. I handed her the routing grid and asked her to own it. My father and I dragged a bulky pallet jack across a wet dock like a shared sentence. When the storm finally blew sideways instead of down, the first truck pulled out with taillights that looked like hope you could chase. I radioed the co-packer floor. They were ahead of schedule. The building hummed back to life, just in time to hear us not panic. The metrics posted Monday read like a plot twist. 0 recall fallout, on-time delivery at 99% through a storm. Waste down 12 points, overtime zeroed without bleeding, throughput. Mateo's email contained 2 sentences and an attachment. The renewed contract at improved terms. I printed the bonus pool sheet and taped it beside the clock-in, not as charity, but as a receipt. In the hallway, my parents found me before I could stage the conversation. My mother didn't apologize with speeches. She asked if the rota could keep her in the afternoon crew because the evenings run better with you on the floor. My father cleared his throat, and in the smallest voice, a proud man owns, asked if I'd review a Kaizen he'd sketched. I said yes to both, then drew a boundary I could live with. We'd talk shop at work and family at a table where no one graded dreams. They nodded. 2 employees, 2 parents, learning the new map.dice. We gathered on the floor the way teams do when a season turns. Not to crown anyone, just to agree out loud on what had changed. I read the numbers once and let the silence weigh them. Deadlines kept, defects dropped, a contract extended because we earned it with dozens of small, unglamorous choices. Envelopes passed hand to hand, bonuses calculated like math, not favors, and a ripple of relief loosened shoulders that had learned to live braced. I said what I wished someone had said to me sooner. Harmony is nice, but respect is non-negotiable. We will argue in daylight and decide by data. We will be generous with credit and stingy with excuses. Eyes found mine, then found the boards where blue lines kept climbing. At the edge, 2 familiar figures didn't reach for the spotlight. They watched the crew claim it. I felt something unclench that had been clenched since before I could name it. Maybe this was forgiveness starting without ceremony. In the small office off the line, she set a worn notebook on the desk. The one with clipped recipes and margin notes in 3 kinds of ink. Ken spoke without the armor of certainty. She said, "Fear makes smart people sound cruel." That she mistook guardianship for guidance. That her voice got loud because she didn't trust the world to listen. I didn't offer absolution like a ribbon. I asked for repair. We drafted an email together to the lender, formally retracting the adverse input and acknowledging the harm. Not to reopen the door, I had walked through another, but to close the loop with honesty. She wrote slowly, careful like surgery, then looked at me the way people look at bridges they once swore were impossible. I told her we'd be family at dinner and colleagues at work, and that both roles required practice. When she left, the notebook remained. Inside, a margin note. Less sugar. More patience. I copied it to my whiteboard. We walked the line at shift change. The noise turned down to a hum that leaves room for truth. He carried a clipboard the way some men carry apologies. Awkward at first, then right. He admitted he'd confused being necessary with being right. That shortcuts had become a language he spoke because time kept daring him. I told him I'd built a company out of refusing shortcuts that changed the taste of things. And he laughed. The small kind that admits relief. We stood by the guide he'd redesigned, the one that had jammed, and he showed me how a millimeter of attention saved an hour of repair. I signed his Kaizen like it mattered because it did, and he signed the new standard like he was saying my name correctly for the first time. When we shook hands, it wasn't a daughter seeking approval or a father granting it. It was 2 professionals agreeing on a better way. I cooked, not to impress but to feed. Simple lentils, warm bread, a salad that didn't try too hard. The apartment held the softness factories shake loose. Chairs scraped, glasses sweated, and conversation arrived like a skittish animal that decided to stay. We set a rule and kept it. No shop talk until dessert, and learned to ask questions that weren't audits. He told a story about his first week on a line that no longer exists. She confessed the relief of not pretending certainty about everything. When plates cleared, I brought out the boxes that built this bridge and watched them take a bite without performing either delight or critique. "Just tasting," he said. "It holds," which is as close as he comes to poetry. She asked what we should call one another at work. I said first names on the floor, the old names here. We practiced both, laughing when we slipped. It felt like learning a choreography where no one needed to win. Morning returned to its first language. Quiet, dough rising, city lights sliding across the counter in slow stripes. I baked a small batch for nobody in particular and boxed 2 for the plant, not as a performance, but as a habit of care. The calendar held meetings with suppliers, a call with the mentor who had taught me to turn momentum into structure, and a visit to a cafe that wanted to stock our 3-item line. The story people liked to tell was simple. The mocked became the boss, but simplicity is a trick of distance. Up close, it looked like this. A ledger of choices, a list of names I refused to turn into enemies, a family reshaped by standards instead of shame. I locked the door, breathed the warm sweetness that still surprises me, and headed out. Titles can vanish, respect you practice. Today, they would clock in, and I would do what I had learned to do best. Lead without needing to be small or loud.